My friend Brent and I are Floridan losers who had the bright idea of working for a scam telemarketing company in Boca Raton. We work together because he doesn't have a car. Florida is basically a no man's land for the FCC, which would normally sweep in and protect consumers from retarded bullshit like fake health insurance and loan negotiators that took out student loans for you. Florida had implemented laws effectively neutering the agency under the premise of the protection of free speech. My name's Alex, and as a proud heroin addict and occasional Florida man, I do this kind of shit. So we ended up working in a storage facility that had air conditioning units in it that was being used by a scam that had been running for some time. We knew friends who had worked there, and they all easily made more than $600 a week, despite being stupid assholes. Brent wanted the job because he knew he could make more. It was all based on how much we sold. Brent's main issue was providing for his 5-year-old son, Mason, a tow-headed curious little thing. His baby mama, Melissa, OD'd and died a year and a half earlier. This further motivated him to believe he could outlie that paycheck. I'm a heroin addict, and I always need money. I was 100 in smack debt, but willing to ask for an additional line of credit if I got this job. We got to the place, a large storage facility with a roll-up metal door off of 441, a road that ran north and south in the middle of nowhere, largely walled by vegetation and swamp. Everyone in the place looked like something happened to their DNA. It had been converted into a makeshift office, but not very well. It had concrete floors, hastily painted thin wood walls, and miserable people. Welcome to employment in Florida. The tiny man interviewing us, John Bopoli, was deeply tanned and had stunning blue eyes. Those were the only features that could be interpreted as positive, as he was horribly bald and had a disgusting complexion, with greasy and uneven features that had pockmarks everywhere, even the scalp. To make matters worse, he was absolutely no more than 5 feet tall. He kind of looked like what would happen if you hit random on the character generation of a video game. An ancient old man who looked like his relative peered at us carefully from over a cubicle wall as we walked into the tiny man's office. He spoke to us both simultaneously. Good morning and welcome to ACK. Alex and Brent, right? We're a fundraising firm that helps several local charities. Before we begin, do either of you have any scheduling issues? He was breathing and speaking rapidly, as if he was in the middle of a nice jog. Yeah, I gotta pick up my kid at 3:30 on Thursdays and Fridays. My mom takes care of him the rest of the week. Another crudely made office across the way sparked to life as a little old lady turned on a light. The socket made an angry popping noise that our new friends seemed to ignore. I made up some excuse to take Mondays off entirely. John ate it up, and even gave a gasp of sympathy when I mentioned my poor mother. Give a Floridan an inch, and he will lie to your face to avoid you at the start of every week. Brent sounded just as depressed about revealing his need for his mother as he did about the possibility of job impediment. It had cost him several decent jobs. That shouldn't be a problem at all. We just like to know beforehand. Please select and read a script from the group in front of you. He smiled happily at Brent, who immediately breathed a sigh of relief and began to read a script with genuine focus. He hadn't had a job in 4 months, and his mom was getting tired of him. When he delivered his performance, he sounded like he actually thought some of this money might go to a charity. I successfully half-assed it. John smiled deeply, revealing several rotten teeth, before enthusiastically giving us a literal thumbs up, as if we had won a game show suddenly. An equally tiny woman, who looked like a relative of Mr. Bopoli's, gave us HR packets. We knew we had a paycheck coming. It was hot, dark, and had stagnant air, despite the uncomfortable roar of the 17 box fans. But the checks were real. Almost every call was someone telling you to fuck off, sometimes with more or less politeness, and usually something about the national do not call list. So it takes some emotional fortitude, but if you sit through it, eventually a sucker comes along. I grabbed the nearest empty cubicle to an air conditioning unit when I walked in with Brent, both of us wisely choosing professional garb, consisting of a shitty t-shirt and athletic shorts for me, and a pair of pressed khakis and a polo shirt for him, to help with the heat and his professional image. I took a look at the one-paragraph script and turned on the phone. "Fuck you," said a young girl.
"Get a real job, you piece of shit,"
demanded an elderly southern gentleman.
"Suck my cock,"
raged what sounded like an old woman.
"Hello?"
said a deep but ambiguously sexed voice. "Hello?" I didn't expect a live person so soon, and I rushed to grab the script. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Brent do the same, and I wished him the best.
"Hello?"
repeated the voice with exactly the same tone. "Hello, sir. I'm calling you today on behalf of the Florida Police Friends Fraternal Assistance Force. How are you doing today?" The script had a much shorter name for each fake organization, but I accidentally said half of my version first. The voice waited for a moment.
"Hello?"
I heard a deep breath.
"You are sick."
"Excuse me?" The line on the other end erupted into a frenzy that sounded like what would happen if deep-voiced birds tried to imitate the sound you get when you call a fax line. The sound was absolutely jarring, and for just a second, I felt sick. I slammed the phone into the receiver. I looked over to Brent, and he had a puzzled expression on his face. For a moment, I thought we got the same call, but then he smiled and began speaking into the phone. At about lunch, I started to feel a little less than fresh, as us junkies tend to. I scurried quietly to the dimly lit bathroom, which was nothing more than a concrete closet with a sink and 2 toilet stalls. I went into one of the stalls, plopped down on the shit-encrusted seat, and took out my kit. It was a wonderful mix that day, and I tied off, cooked a tiny amount to keep me up, and injected all in a short order. I started to feel the wonderful sleepiness wash over me when the door opened. Hey, hello there." I spoke as if I'd been caught already. The bathroom was so small that I got the impression that whoever had just walked in would somehow have to know, but no one responded. I peered down and saw the shoes of the small woman who had given us the HR packets. She stood absolutely stone still. I didn't dare begin to move, but I knew my arm had to get untied. I carefully took out the needle and unwrapped the tourniquet. Before it was all the way off, I heard the door shut again and the feet were gone. When we were driving home, Brent was ecstatic. He had scammed 4 poor bastards out of more money than he would be paid for that week. He even sold some sad old lady a monthly care package for firemen. John had given him an extremely awkward high five on the way out. I felt great for him. I didn't even mind the inevitable pit stops he asked me to make so that he could take care of errands and pick up food for what remained of his food stamp balance. I dropped him off and happily sailed home to use far more drugs than normal. The H felt a bit funny that night, though, and I worried that there might be more fentanyl than normal. I woke up covered in sweat repeatedly throughout the night. The next day, Brent was wearing another great-looking polo shirt, although I think he had already run out of shorts that weren't denim. He had even shaved without nicking the hell out of himself or leaving patches, which he always seemed to do. "All right, man. Alex, are you ready to make some money? Well, I'm a heroin addict, and this doesn't involve fellatio, so yeah, I'm in. He didn't bother laughing. I think I could help you a little with that. I have an extra 20 if you can help me with the pit stop. I think I have to get a door alarm from Best Buy or something today, too. My mom gave me her credit card. Mason tried to walk out the back last night and said some little neighborhood kid was making faces at him. Sure, I was happy for another 20. I usually drove him around out of pity, but this job was brightening things up a bit. Needless to say, he absolutely fucking killed it that day. He triumphantly marched to the whiteboard at the front of the disgusting hovel to mark his kills for the rest of us mutants to marvel at. I, on the other hand, wasn't even getting people cursing at me anymore. It was a sea of empty calls. Occasionally someone picking up the phone because they were confused. More than occasionally, I just heard heavy, rapid breathing. John was already training new employees to replace people who didn't bother showing up, and he had no problem recommending Brent as a source of sales advice. Our employer gave him several cartoonish thumbs up and at least one whoop of delight. It was a Wednesday, and he was acting like he had already gotten a promotion in a real company. That night was a terrible one. My smack worked all right, but I felt worse than groggy. It felt like the dose hated me right back too. My arms stung like holy hell. When I nodded off, I had a horrible nightmare about the marsh fields surrounding our job. I couldn't quite recall it. When I woke up, I had shit the bed, but still felt pretty good. I wondered if it was possible to experience a half withdrawal, or maybe if the stuff I was using was so impure, I was getting a different, more intense high, while at the same time not getting the premium smack and fentanyl I was used to. When I picked up Brent, he looked just as spiffy as the previous day, but had bags under his eyes. Alex, with these incentives, that's like $200, maybe $300 extra. He was absolutely gushing. I could be looking at getting my own place if I keep this up. I tried not to burst his bubble at the fact that this particular company would probably close down and reopen at some random location in 4 weeks, and that this was in fact a scam. South Florida's Craigslist only has scams. I never could figure out if they actually made their money back. Most junkies would sign up to work and then take the training check and run. Brent had gotten a haircut, his first in a couple of months. He had put on some cheap cologne and was waving goodbye to his mother on the way out of the parking lot of the shitty apartment complex. After seeing him mope around for so long after Melissa's death, it was a relief to see him with a facial expression that wasn't hopeless. You want something to eat first? Tacos al Carbon is on the way and we have time. The Mexican restaurant had grown from a small food truck to a small empire. I was pretty stoned and could go for something with eggs and chorizo. That sounds awesome. Mason kept me up all night and I didn't have time to fix breakfast. I guess he's friends with that other kid. He tried to sneak out again to sleep over at his place. I'm glad he's making friends, though. Also, a woodpecker's moved into the neighborhood and has decided to go batshit on every pine tree in the area. I nodded, as if I were an adult capable of understanding what he was going through. I shoveled the breakfast burrito into my mouth, marveling at the mixture of chorizo and crispy fried potatoes, with egg yolk dripping everywhere. He's having a difficult time at school, and my mom can't take any more time off to keep picking him up after outbursts. He's not adapting well to Melissa's death. I wondered if that was even physically possible, but avoided speaking. He borrowed money to pick up a token of ass-kissing for John, who had been happily hovering over him for his first 2 days. His only regret was not doing the interview the previous week. He explained that the incentive scheme would have given him way more if he had crammed an extra day into the week. He was hoping to keep it up and make $1,000 a week, knowing that John's E30 BMW convertible implied that he made a decent living. The quiet, tiny woman and the ancient-looking little brown man all drove nicer cars as well, which gave me the impression that they were keeping it in the family. When we entered the shitty building, the stench of urine and failure seemed to have the opposite effect on Brent than it had on me, exciting him even further. "All right, man, let's do this. I know those calls are weird, but we can make that money." I agreed, but was pretty sure I would have to drop out. I was happy for him, though. When 3:30 came and it was time for us to go, John gave us an over-the-top disappointed look. "You guys sure you don't need any more money?" His gawky expression made me uncomfortable. The quiet woman and old man, who were each about the same height, were clearly paying attention from the cubicles where they watched over the workers. John's voice had become slightly hoarse since we started, and it sounded like he was getting a cold. He coughed bitterly from time to time as he walked among the cubicles. He had a jaundiced look to him that made me want to avoid him more than I usually avoided other obvious junkies. "Remember, if you get 15 in 1 week, you make an entire 10% more on your commish. That's some serious money in your case, Brent." Brent looked heartbroken. John had presented this information with all the seriousness of someone who wasn't a scumbag con artist. Our co-workers were clearly listening in, too. An old black man and a tall Hispanic woman nearby made no effort to disguise their interest. Brent was something of a celebrity in the call center of just 20 people. I know. I have to pick up my son, though." "Well, it happens. If you want, there are always shifts on Friday nights and Saturdays that do great. Normally we only let people with experience in, but you could stop by any time. You would make a lot of money." Brent's smile had twisted into a happy frown. "Do you think my son could hang around on Saturdays? I know that's not normal, but he's really quiet. My mom could drop me off." John perked right up. I had no idea why Brent was being so apologetic. A pale, obese woman and a thin, meek man both had already brought in their kids. Mr. Popoli didn't seem to mind. The fat woman's angry little redhead was especially impressive in my opinion. When I asked him his name, he told me to go fuck myself and kicked me in the shin. "Well, I'm glad to see you have a voracious work ethic to go with those sales." His overly cheery demeanor was like an off-brand commercial. He coughed painfully into his hand, with a small red patter being quickly wiped away before continuing. "That would be fine. We have an extra room where he could watch TV, or something near the entrance that we normally use for training groups." He said this through his rotted smile, giving us 2 thumbs up. Brent pretended that the guy had something resembling social skills and attempted to make some small chat, which John oddly rebuffed by saying that he didn't have any hobbies. At this, Brent nodded in awe and then looked at me nervously. I smiled, not entirely happy about the amount of driving I had quietly signed up for. The next day, he was quite possibly the most well-dressed I had seen him since the Santa Lucia's high school prom. "I hate to ask this, but do you think you could pick up Mason for me? I could actually pay you, believe it or not." For tonight's additional shift? I was confused as to how his scheduling was supposed to work out. "Yeah, I was only going to stay for 3 hours extra. I am getting a lot of cash. I could maybe bribe you into it? Maybe like $100 out of our first paycheck." He grimaced at the pain of asking me to sit around for 3 hours after picking up his kid. I grimaced at the fact that I really needed that $100 for more junk. Maybe a nice load of Xanax, too. I had gone through $60 in celebration over the previous evening, far more than what I had declined to do after being fired from the Wellington Green Mall's P.F. Chang. Alright, man. You gotta do what you gotta do, but you owe me. Dude, thank you so fucking much. I knew he could make a lot of fucking money doing this, but he was really going a bit over the top. He was acting like it was a normal job that would stick around, and even as though I would be fine driving him to the next location. It was difficult to watch him pretend it was a professional gig. He spent the entire ride to Boca, explaining how tonight could bring him up an additional 10%, and how much that might mean. That day was a lot more than rough. Only a few people talked to me. A confused old lady picked up the phone and began weeping uncontrollably when I attempted to speak to her. A few people cursed at me. It was worse than quiet. Brent, on the other hand, was absolutely raking it in. John paced between his cubicle and anyone else, paying attention to almost every call. I guess that he took the lion's share of each sale, so this was probably his personal stash he was keeping track of. When it came time to pick up Mason, he was already looming over my cubicle. I listened in on a lot of your calls, and I know you had a rough week, but I don't think you have anything to worry about. Sometimes people just get empty lines. Keep your chin up, buddy. He said buddy, with the same commercial enthusiasm you might hear on a particularly bad children's show. I muttered something in agreement and tried to keep in mind that I was getting paid genuinely good money to be there. It was time for me to pick up Mason. I had driven with him about a third of the time. Brent had picked him up from the small, shitty charter school he was rotting away in. They didn't seem to particularly give a shit that someone other than his parents was picking him up. He jabbered away happily, focused on his cell phone while we drove. I didn't understand any of it, but he was just as happy as if I had. I awkwardly walked him into the building when we got back. Great to see you again. Who is this? John asked Mason comically. Normally, Mason probably would have introduced himself, but John looked disgusting. He looked like he was about to hit withdrawals, with rheumy eyes that seemed to wander the sky instead of focusing on anyone in particular. My name is Mason, Mason said, clearly unsure of the man. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Mr. Bapoli, and your dad will be out of here in no time. For now, we have a nice room with a TV and some snacks. John smiled and directed me to the small room opposite of his office, where we had our interviews. When I walked in, the small table had a toy gun and 2 bundles of what looked like swampy grasses and vases. A candy bar and a bottle of water was off to the side, next to the tiny ancient television that the child was already ignoring. Mason wandered up and grabbed a tuft of grass that had a beautiful little blue flower I had never seen before. Then he slumped into a seat and began playing on his cell phone. John nodded happily at us and returned to his pacing. I decided it was time to avoid Mr. Bapoli's fate and get a fix, so I excused myself from Mason, waved to Brent so he knew I was going to the bathroom, and went to go nod off. Again, I went through my ritual. This time, the junk was absolutely stupendous in power. A tiny amount, and I felt like I was actually going to catch up to the dragon. I had a second or two to wonder if my dealer had mixed more fentanyl in than normal, before I realized my smack was dark green instead of its normal shit brown. As I slumped against the toilet, I know I heard someone enter the bathroom. I heard excited breathing, almost to the point of what should have been hyperventilating, on the other side of the door. Before nodding off, I became aware of Mr. Bapoli's shoes, standing immediately in front of the door, as fingers interrupted the light from above the sink as I sank into unconsciousness. I I had a brief dream of Mason happily walking through a marsh field. He was singing something in a different language. John was watching him, while the little woman pointed out specific plants of interest. Something was horribly wrong, and I could feel the heat and humidity of the field. It was familiar, and I could think clearly. John looked me in the eyes and gave me a thumbs up. A deep, ambiguously sexed voice spoke with his lips.
Wake.
When I woke up, it was with a start. The syringe was still in my arm, and my head was swimming from a powerful dose of who the fuck knows. But I made every effort to get off the shitter first. I plucked the thing from my arm and untied my now horribly asleep arm. I didn't bother picking anything up off the floor, including my green stash. When I walked back to the main office, people were clustered around Brent, who, according to the board, had made an absurd 4 sales that night. He was standing and talking, as closers love to do, and he was clearly very excited about the prospective number 5 he was wrestling with. The Popolis were nowhere to be found. I trotted, then ran to the room where Mason was. The wall clock told me I had slept for about an hour and a half, and something smelled just slightly worse than normal in this shitty little call center. The loading bay door was entirely open, and that didn't make it any better. I tore the flimsy door open, and smoke billowed out of the tiny, fabricated room. Heat hit me like a wall, and the stench was unbelievable. On the table, the small, red-headed child of our fat co-worker had been hog-tied and was lying on his back. On his stomach, a bright orange burst of fire was rapidly spreading over his clothing, confidently making his flesh bubble. I pulled off my shirt as fast as I could to try and swat the fire out. I didn't see the bottle of water anymore. He was thrashing desperately against his binds and looked up at me, but by the time I took a second step inside the office, the smoke was already making me double over, and the fire had already spread to his face. I heard muffled screaming as I thrashed pathetically at the flames and tried to pull at any part of the boy that wasn't burning. I heard screams erupt behind me as the call center became aware of the fire, and then a single, dreadful moan. Brent almost knocked me over, and before I knew it, was slapping desperately the child he thought was Mason. Cries of no turned into a steady scream of desperation and rage as the child ceased to move, and the fire spread to the table and the cheap walls. He thrashed violently as me and another man, co-worker I never bothered to meet, pulled him out of the burning room. He was still fighting when the EMS arrived. They gave him a shot of Antiven, and he slumped against the ground, eyes fixed on the room where he thought his son was. In my defense, I tried to explain what had happened. I explained the smack, even though the building incinerated any evidence of it. I told them about Bopoli, but they said they couldn't find records of anyone with that name. I told them about the red-headed kid. This they took an interest in, as he was obviously missing. But apparently he had run away from home several times before, and my love of heroin did not make me a believable witness. They decided that the easiest way to wrap this up was that it was Mason in the fire. Anything that could be tested in the lab had been turned to ash, and they couldn't deal with a heroin addict's ramblings. Also, Brent was positive that he had at least an impression of his own son before the fire spread, and the fat woman, also a heroin addict, was just as likely to have eaten her child as to have lost him. Brent and I still talk, I drive him to therapy every now and then to help out his mom. I tried to talk to him about what I think happened, but he cut me off by punching me in the face and breaking my nose. We haven't talked about it since. I really should have Googled Mr. Bopoli's name before we got too deep there. I keep looking out for him to see if he comes back like they say he should in some of the stories. But so far he hasn't.